Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news is a range of items, starting with what could be arguably described as an interesting blog post from Science-Based Medicine on generic drugs. There is a development with regards to the COVID-19 vaccine and the genetics behind making it that much more effective. A test that could tell you whether or not your child will grow out of their peanut butter allergies, or more accurately, peanuts. Microplastics found in blood clots, although, again, take it with a great deal of skepticism as with much other research. A plant virus involved with fighting cancer. The pathogenic bird flu has yet again found a new host, although not the kind of host you might expect. A spectacular but unfortunately incredibly rare alignment of planets, and the UK takes Microsoft to task after its most recent product launch. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with drugs, although clearly not the kind of drugs you might be thinking of, but rather generic drugs. We've spoken about the idea of a big pharmaceutical company trying to evergreen their patent, that is, continuously trying to find developments and means of making it better or more effective, and then patenting that, albeit minor, improvement to ensure that nobody else can copy the newest and greatest version of their drug. In theory, this is fine, because what they're doing is only protecting the newest version. And that's more or less where generics come into play. Generic drugs are the fundamentally original drug, whether it is exactly the same or functionally the same, and that there is the key, and it's very much what Science-Based Medicine goes through on their blog post. A generic drug is where you have a drug that is chemically and functionally almost exactly the same as the original, the brand name if you will, and because it is practically the same and it fulfills all of these same requirements and functions, it can be sold as a substitute for the original drug. But because it hasn't had to go through all of the rigorous testing and difficulty of the original drug, because it only has to go through testing to show it does the same thing, and in the same way, it can be sold for a much lower price. Now, it is important to note that although it is effectively the same drug, there are minor differences. What you basically have is what's called bioequivalence. That is, the drug does the same thing in the same way and is, for all intents and purposes, the same. It's just not. It's kind of like changing out different kinds of vinegar. You might have white vinegar, white wine, red wine, apple cider, and so on. They're all a form of vinegar. There's just small differences, but they will do much the same thing. For most companies, this is great, as they can create a drug based on a currently patented drug, and then sell it in the next 10 to 15 years, and by doing that, they're able to compete. Now, this competition is good for the consumer, largely down to the fact that, well, you can buy drugs for less, given that you now have the original brand name or the generic, and for the most part, they will work exactly the same. They're no weaker, they're no less effective. There shouldn't be any other issues, for the most part. There is one minor element to this that is important to note, and it's having to do with the fact that there are different formulations. Because of this, it is entirely possible that with a greater variety of drugs out there that do the same thing, you might be able to find one that doesn't have the same sort of side effects for you. In fact, this is one of the benefits of the generic market. If the original brand name drug caused certain side effects for you, it is possible, depending on exactly how those side effects occurred, that the generic version won't do that. But again, this is based entirely on those minor variations, and it may only be that the side effects are lessened, not removed entirely. And this brings us to the final thing. It's bioequivalence, and that is how much of the dose can be absorbed by your body at a given time. And that's the other key thing here. Those generics need to demonstrate that they're not going to suddenly release a whole load of the drug into your body at one time, much more than the brand name equivalent would. Because of that, they can do exactly the same job. You get exactly the same dose, exactly the same function, for exactly the same period of time. you don't need to worry about a generic doing something weird and wonderful, or more likely very unpleasant. Rather, obviously, the Science-Based Medicine blog goes through considerably more details. But in other medical news, we have personality changes after organ transplant. And this is a weird thing that doesn't happen very often, thankfully. In fact, it's incredibly rare. And the first reported case was back in 1967. But since then, there haven't been a great many reports of it. In fact, realistically, they only come up once a decade or thereabouts, which either means that they're incredibly rare, or those who would write the case studies can't be bothered, which given the rarity of it, you would think they would. Understand, the evidence for this is incredibly anecdotal, and by that we mean they stretch credibility to an extreme. For example, a heart plant recipient who received a heart from a musician who developed a love for music and wanted to start playing, whilst never having done so before. In other cases, having seen visions, so to say, of the death of the donor. All of these sorts of things are practically verge on unbelievable and may be more a case of, let's say, a psychomatic rather than actual events, something the brain has created by assembling the various bits and pieces of vaguely overheard information. But nonetheless, it still happens, and therein lies the question. Due to its rarity, it's hard to say that it's actually a thing, but it's common enough that there are questions about it. The proposed answer is more in line with what, say, June has with the hereditary memory argument, something that we should address someday, but is, in short, complete nonsense. To be clear, the study that underlines this particular topic is very small. It involved 23 heart transplant recipients and 24 recipients of other organs, so statistically basically useless. But 90% of those recipients did demonstrate the same phenomena, so, as mentioned, at least somewhat widespread, but widespread within a small cohort, which is why we can't translate this to anything else. Or would that be a transplant this to anything else? More so that the different organs involved seem to lead to different results. For example, kidney transplants tended to be associated with issues around anxiety and stress. Then you had heart around the issue of emotions, and then there are others again. Of course, all of this could also be explained by the use of immunosuppressing drugs, which could also change personality. So, there's a lot of questions here, and there's not a lot of answers. Where we do find at least some more answers is regarding the COVID-19 vaccine and a publication within Nature Communications. What they found is that there is a surprising amount of information that can be dragged out of the genome responsible, or part of the genome responsible, for the antigens that are used, the HLA genes, and how the body responds to COVID-19 vaccines. Now, it's important to note here that the HLA genes are a receptor on the leukocytes, that is the white blood cells. And what that does is it allows the white blood cells to better detect and understand what's going on. But there's a lot of variability in the kind of HLA genes that exist, mostly down to, well, different people. Now, we're not saying that there's a whole range across a huge gamete, but there is variability, and that variability is key here. There were about 368,000 participants who received the COVID-19 vaccine, and then of these, about half had their antibody levels measured. So this is kind of useful, but also not really, because they've more or less halved their study randomly. But what they did find is at least somewhat more useful, and given the size, we can say that there is a certain amount of reliability to it. There is a specific part of the HLA gene, it's DQB1*06, and that is the variant that will improve the antibody production in response to vaccination. We say improve for one simple reason. There is between a 20 and 50% improvement in protection based on the different kinds of alleles that were presented. Because of this, it is entirely possible that the correct screening of the genetics of an individual could actually have an effect on the way you vaccinate them. For example, if you know that there is a specific level or threshold at which certain variants of this will produce certain results, you know that you can either provide a greater or lower dose based on the requirements, effectively customizing treatment to each individual. Of course, the issue with customized treatment with vaccines is, well, will people use them? And therein lies the crux of the problem, particularly in the last 30 or so years. Anti-vaxxers have increasingly had an influence in the world, and unfortunately we're seeing the effects of this. In the UK, whooping cough is surging. Understand, whooping cough has a very effective vaccine, and it's very safe. Yet there are now about 3,000 cases in 2024. 3,000 cases that really shouldn't exist. And to be clear, the whooping cough vaccine's been available for decades, and because of that, nobody should have it, at least in the developed world. But therein lies the problem again. People aren't taking the vaccine. This has of course led to infant deaths, unfortunately, with at least 5 children, or more likely infants, dying so far this year. The frustrating part is that, unlike other things like say influenza, which is a virus-based disease, whooping cough is based on a bacteria, specifically the Bordetella pertussis, and unfortunately that means that it's basically really hard to get rid of. Partly down to the fact that, well, if you have it, you're likely to have it around for a while. It takes a bit of time for the body to clear it out. But it also means that, like with, say, influenza, common cold, or COVID-19, it can easily be spread through coughing, but also through contact with the various mucous membranes in your body, for example, your nose, mouth, eyes, and so on. That same source, let's say, means that it's also very easily spread. There's a infection rate of about 1 person spreading to 15, if not 17, other people. And this is unfortunately almost on the same level as measles, which is considered an incredibly infectious disease. This brings us back to the notion of being vaccinated, and in this instance it's actually part of a weirder, larger cycle. Roughly every 6 years or so, you'll find that there is a huge outbreak of whooping cough, and then it dies down again, presumably down to the people realizing that, wow, this is a terrible idea. There are kids sick, there are people sick, and there are even people and kids dying. Perhaps it was a dumb idea not to get the vaccine, and then they proceed to come to their senses, until a new cohort of idiot anti-vaxxers come through and present the cycle all over again. Yeah. This, of course, brings us to treatment, and whilst yes, treatment is possible, it's antibiotics after all. It's a bacteria, you can treat with antibiotics. This is still not a good thing, partly because, well, avoidable disease and therefore protracted treatment shouldn't be necessary, but also the fact that, well, antibiotics, especially for infants, aren't necessarily particularly good for them. In other news related to childhood, we have the joy of allergies, and in this case, peanut allergies. Peanut allergies are a problem, not just because if you like peanut butter, but also, well, if you have an allergy and you go to, say, a Asian restaurant where peanut oil is regularly used, you may well find yourself experiencing a reaction. Anything from a rather mild reaction through to anaphylaxis, and that's the problem. It's kinda hard to avoid it, and, well, for kids who tend to put anything and everything they can find in their mouth, it's particularly a problem. But, at the same time, a lot of kids will outgrow their peanut allergy, thankfully for them anyway. But this is a question. Who, what, where, why, and how? It's kind of random. There's no idea to know which of these kids will outgrow it, until now, where there is a possible test, let's say, that looks at the antibodies as a biomarker to estimate whether or not the children will outgrow their allergy. Of course, assuming that they're not continuously exposed to the peanut to cause the allergic reaction. The test is all focusing on a particular protein called RAH2, and no, unfortunately, it's not got a mascot in the form of an anime girl. The testing itself, as disappointing as it is, has found that that particular protein is somewhat useful in predicting it. However, we do say somewhat, given that it was a small cohort. There are about 156 children, and they're from a relatively narrow geographical region in Australia, so you have to understand that this may not be particularly useful outside of the scope of the study. They looked at kids from 12 months through to about the age of 10, when the allergy is expected to go away. 2/3 of the children didn't outgrow the allergy, which is pretty much to be expected. But those that did had some sort of tolerance by the age of 6, so you know that if the kid's not got over their allergy by the age of 6, they're probably not going to, which could be useful. The test, other than looking at the RH2 protein, also looked at the immunoglobulin E and a particular part of that, and between these two they found that they could get a good idea as to whether or not the allergy would persist or not. If the levels of the RH2 and immunoglobulin E increased, it indicated that it tells you that the not necessarily resistance, but tolerance is decreasing, which rather obviously indicates that the allergies, if not getting worse, at least not improving. In a less useful news, but interesting, it has to do with drugs, but this time illicit drugs. There is a movement at the moment where different, illicit and licit drugs are being consumed in particular ways, and monitoring this has led to a bizarre phenomena. Cannabis or marijuana use has now overtaken regular alcohol consumption as a most common drug used, or at least daily common drug used, which is bizarre, but nonetheless, it's a phenomena, and the phenomena can be important, mostly because, there is notable relationships with cannabis use, and particularly a large-scale and regular use, that are relevant to psychology, and particularly psychiatric conditions. So, alcohol will destroy the body, and to an extent the mind. Cannabis seems to focus primarily on the mind. We should point out that although the research has effectively claimed that marijuana use has overtaken alcohol, it is, let's say, not necessarily easy to compare the results, particularly year on year. And it's down to the nature of how they've collected the data. The data is being collected using surveys. Now, the survey data goes back to 1979, and you can imagine with how far back it's gone, it's not realistic to think that, they'd be using electronic collection methods. In fact, that was pen and paper, or pencil and paper at the time, and those survey response rates were kinda shit. In fact, they were absolutely terrible, but that's pretty typical for surveys. Further, they've also altered the area in which they're collecting data. It's gone from continental USA to include Hawaii and Alaska. It's also altered the demographics it's collected said data from. It was originally fairly limited, but now it includes college students, civilians at military bases, and homeless people. Yeah, it's basically just taken a completely different approach to the original studies, so you can't necessarily claim that marijuana has overtaken alcohol. It's entirely and very much arguably the case that it always was used more frequently, but by particular demographics. In other long-term studies, let's say, we have an analysis of blood clots, and no, it's not anti-vaxxer nonsense about the vaccines cause blood clots, thankfully. In this case, it's the discovery of microplastics in blood clots, but specifically in the heart, brain, and legs. Now, there is a very tenuous, and let's be clear, we're talking, this is a thin thread that they're trying to pluck without breaking, that says that microplastics are found in these clots, and that there is an association. Yeah, it's possible, but we also need to look at this as it's one study with 30 patients. Yeah. Further, other studies were similarly small, having about 250 patients. What's important is that we don't also know if plastic is the cause, or if it's simply caught up in the process of creating a plaque in the arteries, or a blood clot, if you will. And this is a big problem, largely down to the fact that just about every study that's looked into this has had issues around comorbidities. So again, we don't know whether or not the comorbidities are leading to microplastics or if there's something else going on. For example, if you have diabetes, and diabetes is generally type 2 in the elderly, and most of these studies were above 65 years in age, meaning that you likely had a high consumption of processed food. Processed food is nearly always typically provided in plastic, so you don't know if the plastic is contributing to this, or if the diabetes is causing the blood clots, and it's just effectively a side effect or a complementary inclusion. There's also a lot of issues around the fact that concentration didn't seem to be related necessarily. Now, there was a wide variation in the concentration of these microplastics, but the study can't establish whether or not that variation was going to affect the severity or the size of the blood clot, so to say. There's also the simple fact that the study is purely observational, largely owing to the fact that you can't just give people microplastics and see if they develop a blood clot. Theoretically, rodent experiments could, but rodent models of this would be, the ethics committee would have a lot of questions, and you'd have to spend a lot of time trying to justify yourself. In a slightly more controversial news than animal research alone, we have resurrecting ancient viruses from 50,000-year-old Neanderthals. Have these people never watched a Hollywood horror movie regarding diseases? You don't just go around poking and prodding ancient diseases, particularly viruses. They tend to wake up and be very grumpy and throw an absolute hissy fit, leading to death and destruction. It's much better than novel diseases being made in labs, like that found in Raccoon City, but nonetheless, what's important here is that Neanderthals are basically our closest living relatives, more so than any of the currently living apes at least. And because of this, and the significant amount of, interbreeding between us, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, there is a possibility that, viruses in Neanderthal DNA could theoretically still be able to move between us, or more accurately, among us, now in the form of Homo sapiens, as well, although some people may seem like Neanderthals, there aren't any actual Neanderthals alive today. Where this begins to get really interesting, at least, other than the notion of ancient viruses being resurrected, is what it indicates. And this is one of the key things here. What the research appears to find is that if you have an ancient virus like this, and it was also similarly present in humans in the form of Homo sapiens, it's entirely possible that we as a species recreated something similar to the smallpox blankets phenomena. That is, diseases from the old world, Europe basically, were taken to the new world, whether that is South America or North America. And those new diseases, since the people there had never encountered them, basically led to them being wiped out. Now, this could either be done deliberately, like with smallpox blankets, or inadvertently, due to exposure. And that's the thing here. They appear to have found that 3 viruses from today are very similar to what they found in this Neanderthal DNA, indicating that it's entirely possible, if not likely, that Homo sapiens shared their viruses, sharing love, if you will. And in this case, love may not have been quite the method. The viruses were the common cold, the herpes virus, and the papillomavirus. At least one of these, if not 2, are shared during intercourse. Do mind that the entirety of the research is currently in a pre-publication server, so it is yet to be peer-reviewed, but having not seen any major critiques of it so far, it seems reasonable to think that at least the findings are true, even if the implications are not. In other viral news, and this time literal virus news, plant viruses are being used to treat cancer, albeit only in rodents. The mice in question are of a particular variety that are known to, but then they were given a virus, the cowpea mosaic virus, and it appeared to significantly improve survival rates and reduce tumor size. Kinds of tumors that were found to be affected included ovarian, colon, and even breast tumors. The efficacy of this was comparable to a surgical intervention. Now, there's a kind of important element to this, and it does need to be laid out very clearly. The cowpea mosaic virus cannot infect human cells, which is good. In fact, it can't infect any mammal cell. But what's important here is that the immune system still recognizes it as not only foreign, but as a pathogen, meaning the immune system can develop a immunological response to it. And therein lies the important key here. That immunological response is not just a strong response, but effectively has the benefit of improving the immunological response and sensitivity to tumors, thereby making it possible for the human body to pick them up where previously it could not. Now, the researchers don't claim that this could be used as a treatment in and of itself. What instead they believe is that this could be used as a prophylaxis, effectively preventing the development of the tumors in the first place. Even if it doesn't prevent the development of the tumor, it will significantly reduce the growth rate and significance of the tumor. Theoretically, and this is a massive theoretically, giving more time for treatment to be more targeted towards addressing it, whether that is something like chemotherapy or surgery itself. In other animal and disease-related news, we have a confirmed second case of bird flu in humans, which is great. Just great. At this stage, hopefully bird flu will not become the next COVID-19, as 2020 was already fun enough as it is. But it is entirely possible with a second case in about a week, we may yet see bird flu spreading more and more into humans, and if it spreads into humans, it'll begin eventually spreading between humans. Thankfully, neither of the cases diagnosed so far have actually involved any spread between humans, and both have been relatively minor infections. That is, they had very few symptoms and would only really be known about because there is particularly active monitoring of this. The good news that at least somewhat limits the possibility of a repeat of 2020 is that the CDC doesn't foresee a need to raise the risk level of bird flu at the moment. And it's because most of the spread has only been in dairy farmers, and it has only been sporadic infections. This is the important caveat here. So far, and so far is a worry. That's because one of these infections is in Michigan. That is basically the very top of America. The other diagnosed case was in Texas, basically the very bottom of America. You've just had two cases at the extreme ends, not the sides, but the top and bottom of America, and there's basically nothing to link them, meaning that in both instances, the dairy farmer was infected basically the same way, that is, cow to human. What's more worrying is that the USDA, or United States Department of Agriculture, has identified a cow-to-cow spread. See, that's a worry there, because once the disease starts spreading between one mammal, in this case cows, the possibility of it spreading between another mammal, for example humans, gets significantly greater. This is coupled somewhat with the fact that this has occurred despite there being no mutations within the virus that should theoretically make it more transmittable. So far we basically have a whole raft of chickens, in fact millions, that have had to be culled due to bird flu if they're not already dead from it. We have cows, and to an extent we have pigs. We also need to add basically the whole city of New York on top of this now as well. And that's down to the fact that, well, bird flu has been detected in the birds in New York City. To be clear, we're talking about the city, not the state, and that's a bit of a worry as well. Partly down to New York City being an absolute shithole, but also because New York City is incredibly heavily populated. The density of people, along with rodents, is a concern here. When we think about it this way, if you think rodents will eat basically anything and everything, and New York City rats are notorious, there's a good chance that at some point they will be infected. Once that happens, we need to worry, because at least in New York City, since rats are everywhere, and New York City is incredibly densely populated, there's a good chance that at some point the disease will go from a rat to a human, and then we have another vector now that will infect us as a species. It is worth pointing out that what we're describing is arguably the worst case scenario, and it's the worst case scenario because so far there have officially been no diagnosed cases of bird flu in humans in New York City. But then again, living in New York City, you basically have to spend all of your money on accommodation and there's no real chance of being able to get medical care. But facetious arguments aside, at least officially, there's no evidence of animal to human transmission, which is better than nothing. It's also possible that any rodents or other animals in New York City that were infected with bird flu died before being able to transmit it to humans, given that it seems to be particularly nasty. There were instances of other species that had been infected and died after consuming raw milk. Shifting to what is effectively agricultural news, but really it's specifically on the banana. There's a study that looks at banana peels and what you can use them for. In this case, they tried converting banana peels into a form of flour, which is an odd choice, but sure. When you add about 7% banana peel flour to anything you're cooking, it doesn't appear to have any adverse effects on the flavor, taste, or appearance. More than 7% or thereabouts, and it became very hard and considerably more brown, and therefore not particularly enjoyable to eat. But at 7% or thereabouts, it did provide considerably greater levels of fiber, magnesium, potassium, and certain antioxidants, which were of benefit, particularly for baked treats. It also significantly improved the longevity of its shelf storage. In news that's completely out of this world, and actually out of this world, it's a planetary alignment, so if you're into astronomy, this could be a cool opportunity. We're going to see 6 of the planets line up between the 3rd and 4th of June. In fact, you're probably going to be seeing them in the very, very early hours of the morning. You'll observe Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, all line up in a straight line. In fact, if you're going to be inclined, you could make an argument that even with the moon there, you could say that you have 7 planets aligning. In a way, anyway. At this stage, however, we've received no news that there'll be Eldritch beings summoned, an attempt to travel in time, or anything else that's exciting, other than the rather obvious astronomical event, which in and of itself is pretty damn cool. Unlike most recent astronomical events, where you could really only observe these from either the more northern or southern latitudes, for example the aurora, or the America-only eclipse of the sun, this should be visible from entirety of the world. Mostly visible, however, from around the 3rd of June or thereabouts. Speaking of things that are going to occur that are rare and unusual, we have technology news, but technology news that's just amazing. It's the development of an AI system that detects sarcasm. Okay. Surely there are better things that could be worked on, but sure, sarcasm detection, let's go with that. The theory behind it is at least somewhat more useful if you scrape just below the surface. And sarcasm is something that's pretty much unique to humans, and at least in terms of what AI will see in terms of written text, it's almost impossible to be able to identify it unless you're familiar with the context. And even then, it's often missed. This means that AI should, at this point, be becoming increasingly familiar with the lowest form of wit. And that's the key here. It's able to identify something funny, but also funny in a way that's completely atypical for terms of AI. And it can reliably do so. Although the article is labeled AI, it's important to note that this is not actually AI. Like everything else we've mentioned involving the term AI, they're pretty much all machine learning algorithms. Admittedly very complex and very advanced machine learning algorithms, but still advanced machine learning algorithms, not AI. In fact, the researchers themselves describe it as such. The last piece of news we have for you is also technology related and also labeled as AI, but not, except this time Microsoft is doing a very different argument than simply admitting that they've done and goofed. They've created a new service, if you want to call it such, which takes screenshots of your computer screen regularly. Now this sounds kind of worrying, given that, well, Microsoft's not particularly well known for being the nicest of companies, but in this case, it's the privacy aspect that has people worried. Microsoft has basically said that what they've developed is a product called Recall, Recall's intended to be able to take screenshots during meetings, presentations, gaming, and so on, and then holds them in a sort of temporary storage. You can then go back through and scroll through these screenshots. The feature itself is on automatically. Now, the fact that Microsoft's not only rolled out a new product or feature in your computer OS, but has automatically activated it seems rather intrusive, which is part of what has the privacy activists worried. What also has them worried is whether or not, let's say Microsoft has access to this. Microsoft has in response said that all of these screenshots are only saved locally, encrypted, and not accessible by Windows. We're going to call bullshit on this because, Apple said exactly the same thing about the photos on their iPhones and other Apple devices, which was found out that no, actually, they were using it to train their particular algorithms to detect malicious content, let's call it that. Which is interesting, given that they didn't make this well known until it was discovered, and then they tried defending it with the think of the children argument, something Microsoft is likely to try eventually. Things get even more worrying again, other than the fact that it's taking seemingly spontaneous and random screenshots of your computer screen regularly. The content of the screenshot is not protected at all, at least not in the terms of what you want to avoid being seen in a screenshot. For example, your username, your password, your credit card information, a lot of sensitive content that should not be recorded this way. Yeah, sure, it may be protected in theory, but if somebody has access to the computer, whether physically or through technological means such as hacking, they now have a absolute treasure trove of data. It's not just data about this sort of thing, but your history and activities, which could be a problem. And it's why some are arguably calling it invasive spyware, if not just outright malware. This is where the UK's government, in the form of the Information Commission, has stepped in to make, as they put it, inquiries with Microsoft, particularly regarding safeguards to protect privacy. And, based on what we've explained so far, whatever safeguards that may exist are likely to be rather useless. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.